Right, this is a talk called Nuclear-Powered Software Security. It's got two sort of main themes running through it. The first is something that most of you in this room probably won't have encountered in your professional lives, which is safety-critical systems. That is sort of systems where we've got quite a bit of feedback on the mic. Can we sort that? Where sort of human life is in danger if the system goes wrong, or it can cause significant damage to property. Don't know what we can do about that. The second is one that you should all be taking very seriously in your professional lives, which is software security. Now, the goal here is to sort of show some of the engineering techniques which are used in making systems that need to be safe, and having a look and see if there's any techniques that we can borrow for making systems that are secure. Okay? The first thing I'm going to go on is we're not going to cover any lists. So you might be familiar with things like the OWASP top 10. We're not going to be looking at anything like that. The trouble is, if you're looking at security and you take a list of problems that you might want to solve, then if you fix the top 10 on that list, you're going to end up getting caught out by number 11. Okay? So what we're going to be looking at instead is some general purpose techniques which you can use to try and give you a well-rounded security focus in your applications. Given this talk is named Nuclear Power Software Security, you probably guessed we're also going to be having a look at some nuclear power plants. When we talk about nuclear power, a lot of people find it quite frightening, because when they sort of think about nuclear stuff, their mind jumps to this. Okay? However, this is not actually a nuclear power plant, it's a nuclear bomb. And nuclear bombs are not very safe, so we're not going to look at any of those today. Okay? It is actually quite hard to make nuclear material go boom like that. It takes quite a lot of very specialized engineering to make a bomb. And typically, a nuclear reactor won't even contain enough radioactive material to go boom in that way. It still presents a problem to us, though, because although it can't go nuclear and blow up like a huge area of land, radioactive material is still really dangerous to humans. Okay, it can cause quite a lot of sort of unseen health problems like cancers and birth defects, and it's quite difficult. You sort of don't. If there was a radioactive source in this room, you'd not know about it. You can't taste it, you can't see it, you can't smell it. So it's still quite dangerous to us. And so one of the challenges for a nuclear power plant is to prevent that material from leaking outside of the reactor and leaking outside of the plant. And that's most of what the sort of the engineering into the safety side of it goes into. So let's understand why this is a hard problem and have a look at quickly how a nuclear power plant works. So like most power plants, in order to generate electricity, the nuclear reactor will generate heat, which heats water. That water is then used to drive a turbine. As you can see on the sort of right here, that's sort of how that part of it works. And in order to produce the heat, you've got a nuclear reaction going on inside the reaction chamber on the side. So what happens inside that is you're splitting a uranium atom or a plutonium atom. And when you do that, it releases a few neutrons, which are a small part of an atom, and a bit of energy. That energy is released as heat, which is what's used to heat the water. As part of sort of the control systems, the reactor also features two elements, which is, you can see the graphite moderator on the side there. That acts to slow the neutrons that are released down and make it more likely that they'll impact with further uranium atoms in the reactor, which then sustains the reaction and causes more decays and then more heat loss. And you've also got the control rods at the top. Now they tend to contain a material that absorbs the neutrons. So if they're inserted into the reactor, it slows the reaction down by absorbing those neutrons and slowing the nuclear reactor down. Okay? Unlike conventional reactors that use gas or coal or anything like that, a nuclear reactor will continue to produce heat even after it's switched off and even after the control rods are inserted. And that heat can get up to quite dangerous levels. So even in the event that you've turned your plant off and you're no longer generating electricity, you still need to keep the water circulating to keep that reactor cool. Okay? And that is the sort of the big challenge that a nuclear power plant faces. So let's look at one of the first techniques that actually goes into doing this, We've identified something we really don't want to happen to a nuclear power plant. We don't want it to get too hot, because when it gets too hot, the fuel rods melt, the reaction vessel melts, and all that material gets sort of released out into the environment. So in doing that, we've already taken our first step towards a technique called fault tree analysis. Now, fault tree analysis is a technique that we use to analyse things which can go wrong in a system, and you start from something you don't want to happen. So for a nuclear power plant, you say, we don't want a meltdown. We don't want to like lose cooling to our power plant, which will cause bad things to happen, right? And then you sort of trace back and say, well, what events can lead to us having a meltdown and an unstable situation? And by sort of charting them out and looking at them, you can sort of analyse the categories of failure and sort of look at how you might prevent them. Taking a simple example, bad thing that could happen at the top, loss of cooling. If we can't keep our reactor cool, it melts down. Now, in this simple example, we've said that there's two ways this could potentially happen. If we have a power failure to the pumps, they'll obviously stop being able to circulate water. That causes our bad situation. And also, if one of the valves in the cooling system gets blocked up by something, but like accumulated debris or something like that, it's also going to stop the water from circulating and cause a loss of cooling. You'll notice that we've got a Boolean OR gate at the top there. It's combining the two, and it's saying that we'll lose cooling if one of these two things will happen. Okay? So in the event that a valve is blocked, the reactor loses cooling. In the event of a power failure, the reactor loses cooling. Okay? Another thing we can look at, we can break it down a bit further and say, in order to get to the loss of power, there's two potential ways that can happen because we've got backup power systems. Under normal operating circumstances, we pull in power from the national grid to keep our cooling systems running. And in the event that fails, we've also got a diesel generator, which can be turned on and generate enough power to run the vital systems. You'll notice that these two have been combined by an AND gate, so that in order to actually lead to this loss of power event, both of those have to fail. So, there's another sort of condition that we can put on that, and that we can say that we're not actually worried about losing power while the reactor is running, because obviously it's an electric reactor, it's generating electricity. If it's running, it can generate electricity to run its own pumps and everything like that. So we've got this sort of hexagonal gate at the top here, which is called an Inhibit gate. And what that does is it says, if the event on the right is true, this cannot happen. So any part of the tree below that we just ignore while the case is true. Obviously, once we turn the reactor off, that gate becomes active and failures from below that can propagate up and cause bad things. This failure case, sort of all these backups failing, might seem quite unlikely, but it's actually what happened with the Fukushima power plant in Japan when the earthquake caused the reactor to shut down through standard safety procedures. And then that earthquake also took out the connection to the national grid. They spun up the diesel generators to keep the cooling running, but unfortunately, about an hour or so later, the plant was struck by a tidal wave, which swamped the rooms containing the diesel generators and took them out as well, meaning that they completely lost power to the reactor. And, well, you sort of kind of probably followed the news and saw what happened from there on. So, let's have a look at how we can use this for security. I hope you've sort of already sort of thought through how this diagram could sort of apply to a security situation. We're going to take a look at an e-commerce site. In this particular example here, I'm saying that one of the bad things that we don't want to happen to our site is for someone to hack in and steal all our customer data. Okay, that's going to be quite bad for the company's reputation, and we're going to have to compensate the customers with like identity theft protection, things like that, fraud protection on their credit cards. We don't want that to happen. So what we've said is there's a couple of ways that this could potentially happen in our system. One is if an attacker was to be able to directly log into our database server and just download the information. Another might be if they rang up the customer services and said, hey, I've forgotten my password. Can you sort of log me in, sort it out, and sort of try and get in through the sort of like customer service portal. That obviously is combined by an OR gate at the top. We can then extend that further and have a more detailed look at our customer service rep route on our system. And we say that, well, there's three ways we can think of that the customer service portal could be compromised by an attacker. One might be that they obtain the password for the account. Okay. Another might be to hijack the browser session using some sort of XSS exploit, perhaps something like that. Another might be something you may not consider normally in a technical situation, but they might just phone up and say, hey, try and get the information out of them that way, and sort of social engineer some data about your customers out of the person on the other end of the phone. Each of these can be sort of considered for the risk that it might occur. And we can sort of use a diagram to explore the security properties of our system. Take a look at things that you think are quite highly likely, like maybe a password being stolen or guessed. You might consider that to be quite high risk. Whereas something like social engineering, you might say, well, maybe that's a low risk because they're only going to be able to get access to one or maybe two accounts, so it's not as bad as them being able to just log in and download everything. You can then consider mitigations for these risks. For example, for the password situation, you could require that all your customer service accounts have a two-factor authentication key. That would mean that not only does your attacker need to guess the password, but they also have to somehow steal or hijack that two-factor authentication token. That would turn that side of the tree from a OR gate into an AND gate, because there's two things that they need to do to sort of breach that part. You might notice that we've mitigated that risk, but not entirely eliminated it, because obviously there's still a risk. It's just much lower now. When you're sort of analysing this, when you've reduced a risk, you then reanalyse your security tree and say, is this now a risk that we can accept? Is it low enough probability that it's going to occur that we can sort of accept that as a business and say, we've done what we can do to secure this data. Not all migrations that you'll identify through this graph are necessarily a technical migration. Social engineering is a very difficult thing to try and solve from a technical point of view. So this technique can actually go further than just your software and can inform policies like training, for example, for your staff to help them recognize social engineering attacks and react to them appropriately by ensuring that the customer is actually who they say they are before divulging any personal information. So that previous section was highlighting a way you can sort of analyze the system. Another technique that is used to secure systems, we can use to secure systems and is used to make systems safe, is defense in depth. The idea basically is that you don't have just one layer of defense for a particular path up your tree. You have layers of defense so that if one is breached, you've still got another one behind it. Just dealing with the root cause, it's like the outer boundaries of your system, is quite often insufficient. In software security, this is the kind of thinking that leads to a very fragile security state, where you go, we're going to put this really big firewall in place, and we're going to put the big bad internet on one side of it, and we're going to put our nice, safe, secure internal network on the other side, and we don't have to worry about security in this bit because this big firewall is going to protect us from the big bad internet. That's not really the case. Okay? It works fairly well in practice, because if that firewall is configured properly, it cuts out a lot of the really low-level attacks. But it means that once that outer shell is penetrated and you've got an attacker in your network, they can just run rampant and do all sorts of bad things. Okay? It gets to the point that if that didn't work well, you would be seeing a lot more breaches. But we can do better. Modern-day computer systems rely on massive amounts of interconnected parts. It's inconceivable that we can build a system these days which doesn't rely on connecting to lots of different APIs and things like that. So because we're building on so many parts and so many like third-party libraries, it's completely inconceivable that something in there will not have a security failure potentially waiting to happen in there. So the concept of defense in depth is how we can actually limit the damage that an attacker can do if they penetrate one of these layers of security, or manage to find a vulnerability in one of the libraries we're using, at least make sure that they can't use that to leverage even greater access to the systems. So let's go back to our nuclear power plant and consider this diagram, which is the reaction, sort of a simplified version of the reaction vessel of a nuclear power plant. In this, you can actually see there are multiple levels of defense which prevent the release of the radioactive material into the environment. Starting with the fuel casing in the middle, it's an inert ceramic compound which is very unreactive, so it won't sort of catch fire and things like that, hopefully. It needs to get to very high temperatures before it does. Outside of that, you've got a metal cladding around the fuel rod, which is designed to keep it physically intact if it's dropped or anything like that. And then around that, you've got a very tough outer layer of the reaction vessel, which is usually very thick steel or sometimes lead, which absorbs radiation and contains anything that goes wrong inside. And then outside of that, you've got a control building, which will usually be quite thick concrete walls, and quite a lot of them these days are designed to withstand the impact of even like an aeroplane crashing into them without the aeroplane penetrating into the inside. So all those sort of layers add up so that if something goes wrong in the middle, you've got plenty of different layers to contain that meltdown within the environment of the plant and not release it into the wider world. If we take a look back to our e-commerce diagram and consider the risk on the other side of the tree of maybe an attacker getting direct access to the database, we probably presume that it's behind some sort of access control firewall, so you need to be on the company's network to be able to access it. But if they manage to sort of penetrate that network and they're on the network and they can just connect straight to the database with direct access, that's one potential avenue of risk. Another might be if they've compromised your web server through a flaw in your software or maybe a flaw in the operating system and they've managed to log in, they can possibly use that to be able to log straight into your database server. One layer of defense in depth we could add here is to require a username and password. Quite simple for the database. But that kind of only helps us against the direct access route. If someone's compromised the web server, they'll be able to obtain those credentials because they're what the web server uses. That's not to say that you shouldn't implement that layer of defense. It's still a very valuable layer to have there, but it doesn't solve everything. So, another layer that we might consider doing is encrypting the data in our database. So we've got the username and password to access it, which sort of helps us against direct access. And now to sort of defend against maybe the web server being compromised, we encrypt the data. Now, you might sort of think at the first thought, well, maybe this is going to have the same problem as username and password in the fact that I've got to have my encryption keys on the web server. Fortunately, with cryptography, we've got a few extra options here, and you can get hardware security modules, which you can plug into the server, and they keep your keys secure and stop the attacker from sort of like just downloading them and reading them, which means all the decryption and things like that has to happen on the server. This effectively turns this into a two-way thing where they've either got to somehow compromise that hardware security module to extract the keys, or they've got to go through the process of decrypting all your data on the server before they download it. Now, hopefully, you've all got monitor in place on your servers, and if someone suddenly starts trying to decrypt your whole database, you're going to see CPU spikes, and you're going to go, something's not quite right there, and that's going to give you a chance to investigate and stop them getting away with your entire database. Okay? Another option you could potentially have if you've got really sensitive data like medical information or credit cards is you have the public key for that data on the web server, which is responsible for creating that data in the first place. But when you're doing processing on that data, you can do that on a back-end server which is not connected to the internet and has another layer of defense between it and the rest of your network. And that can have the private key. And only that server then is able to read that data and use it to charge cards or process the medical information for generating insurance quotes or something like that. Okay? So, we'll move on to our third technique. It's called zonal safety analysis. Now, this is one of several techniques which is used in safety critical systems to look for common causes of failure of a system. Obviously, a common cause of failure is going to be quite a bad thing in a piece of software because if you have several layers of defense or several sort of things that have to be overcome before an attacker can break into your system or before a system will become unsafe, but one common cause can get them through all of those layers or can cause all of those layers to fail, then it's as good as not having them at all, and you've just got sort of one route into your system, effectively. And it turns one of those nice AND gates, which reduce the probability of problems happening, into an OR gate, which increases the probability of something happening. This kind of analysis is actually more common in aircraft design. So we're going to take a step away slightly from nuclear power plants for the moment and have a look at aircraft. The aircraft pictured there is a McDonnell Douglas DC-1010. Now, on the 19th of July, 1989, there was quite a famous accident involving one of these planes. So what happened? You'll see it's a bit of an odd design because it's got two engines on the wings, but it's also got a third engine up on the tail there. And what happened is shortly after takeoff, that second engine on the tail there suffered a catastrophic failure. And the design of the aircraft at the time had the hydraulic systems. Each engine drove its own hydraulic system. So as soon as that engine failed, the number 2 hydraulic system was out of action because there was no power to it and it couldn't be used. Fortunately, the plane has 2 backups. Okay. The problem was the pipe work for system number 1 and number 3 also went through the tail section of the plane. And when that engine failed, one of the fan blades broke off, cut straight out of the engine casing and straight through all 3 hydraulic lines, which meant the plane didn't have any hydraulic control at all. I don't know if anyone's a pilot here, but I'm under the impression that without hydraulics, it's really hard to fly a plane. That is actually true, because you can't control any of the flaps on the wings and the rudder and things like that. Fortunately, for that particular flight, the guy flying it was a really experienced glider pilot. And not only that, but the training instructor for the model of plane was also one of the passengers on the plane. And between them, they managed to sort of cobble together a solution where they were varying the power to the remaining 2 engines and used it to sort of steer the plane and bring it into a kind of a crash landing a long way away from any populated areas, and actually managed to save the life of nearly half the passengers on board, which was quite an achievement given that they had no control of the plane at all. But this is sort of like an example of where zonal failures happen and can cause even backup systems to sort of fail completely. What can we learn from this in terms of software security? So for a physical system, such as a plane or a nuclear power plant, zonal analysis is fairly straightforward. Usually it involves looking at a system and saying, if this component explodes, what's it going to take out with it? Are we going to lose other systems that are important? Are we going to lose backups? And if you say, yes, actually, that's a bad idea if that explodes, you move the system somewhere else. So maybe you move the backup to the front of the plane instead of the back of the plane. And that helps to improve the safety of the overall system, because if something goes wrong in one place, you've still got your backup somewhere else. It might initially seem that doesn't translate very well to a computer system. I don't know about you, but I don't tend to work with computer systems that explode. But what we can take when moving into the realm of system security is to look out for areas where one failure causes a cascading chain of failures on related systems. Sort of like a common cause for a security failure. So what are some examples of this? Administrator passwords. I imagine quite a lot of you have administrator logins to servers, and if you can imagine that an attacker somehow manages to get hold of one of those logins, they're going to be able to access all of your servers. So even if each one of them is individually secured with firewalls and everything like that, they've got a password that can override all of that security, and then get in, they probably get root, and they can do whatever they like. Okay? A compromise with a high level of access, like an administrator root password, gives you a huge amount of scope for doing other nasty, bad things. One of the things we could do to defend against this, perhaps, would be to use public keys, which are a little bit harder to compromise, or require 2-factor auth on our systems. Another option that's possibly available to you would be to use some sort of vault-type system, which So an administrator doesn't actually log directly into a system, but they log into a vault, which has higher degrees of security, and then it issues temporary credentials for the servers that you then need to log into. That can sort of help diffuse this problem a little bit. Another thing you might want to look at if you're doing sort of a zonal analysis is shared systems. This could be a centralized logging server, if you've got like an elk stack somewhere, doing all your monitoring and things. Backup servers, if you're storing all your backups on one set of servers somewhere, that could be used to potentially break into several of your different systems. Or maybe you've got a shared database server, which contains all the information for your entire company, and only part of that is actually used by the web server necessarily. Some of the defenses we could employ if you've got some of these shared systems is not logging sensitive information into them. For example, passwords, keep them out of your logs. Make sure there's no information in that log that could help an attacker if they manage to compromise that stack. Turn that into a compromise of your wider system. Doing things like encrypting backups and keeping the keys offline, separate to the servers, can also help with that sort of situation. Because even if they break into that backup server, they've got an encrypted blob, they can't really do anything with it. It's not going to spread that sort of security failure to your wider system. The recent ransomware attacks you've probably heard of that sort of swept through the NHS, and another one more recently that's sort of a bit more nasty, is another example of a zonal security failure. A single sort of flaw in the operating system, I believe it was sort of like an SMB vulnerability, allowed a piece of malware to spread sort of unchecked through companies' networks once it sort of got behind their firewall. If greater attention had been sort of paid up front to isolating these systems, the infection would have been slowed down. I mean, you think about it, if your customer service staff are sat in there, does their laptop really need to be able to talk to the laptop of the guy next to them? Probably not. You can probably get some firewall rules in there that actually stop traffic from transferring between the two hosts. That would have sort of slowed down this sort of malware spread. It also highlights the importance of keeping up to date with security patches, because if you've got a shared operating system across your entire stack, if a vulnerability comes out for that operating system, everything you've got is vulnerable. So you need to keep on top of those patches. Assume everything is open to the internet. When you're trying to reduce your vulnerability to these zonal security issues, if you assume that every system is sort of directly connected to the big bad outside world, you sort of start to take on a little bit of a different mindset and treat everything coming into that system, that subsystem, as suspicious data. So you just filter anything out. If that system is just a web server and you're getting SSH connections into it, drop them. Don't let them get anywhere near. That's the kind of sort of thinking that you need to be doing to lock down these systems and improve the security. It'll get a long way towards stopping an attacker once they've actually gotten into your network, if you're thinking in this kind of way. Another thing we can use zonal analysis for is to look at data which is stored within our systems. By looking at the components within our system that have access to data, we can identify hotspots, areas which contain a lot of high-value information, either because there's a lot of information there, sort of millions of rows, records about our customers, or maybe it's just high-value information like credit card details or medical information, that kind of data. And you can say, well, that's a hotspot in our application. We need to focus and make sure that we're doing as much as we can on that hotspot. Focusing on those gives you quite a good return on your investment. So if you're just trying to secure little endpoints and things like that, it's going to take you a lot of effort to sort of roll out security updates to everything across the stack. It's necessary to do, but if you sort of focus in on where your high-value targets are, that's where an attacker is going to go after if they breach your network. If they're looking to sort of attack your system, they're going to be going after the credit card information. They're going to go after the financial information. They're going to go after the data that they can use to damage your company potentially, or sell. So if you identify those hotspots and fortify them, you're sort of keeping that away from the attackers a little bit better. Another thing you can do, which is a little bit more of a robust long-term strategy, would be to try and reduce the amount of data in these hotspots. One of the things you can sort of do is say, well, Do we need to keep a record of every customer transaction since the start of time? Marketing will probably say yes. Really? Do you? Is it going to be helpful to know what someone bought 10 years ago? Probably not. If they absolutely or really, really, really keen on keeping this data, you can say, well, okay, what if we just take the most recent 2 or 3 years and leave that online, and we take the sort of like the historic data and we store it somewhere a little bit offline. It might take a little bit more time to access it because it's like on a different server somewhere, but it's out of the way, and it means that if our web systems get compromised, they're only going to get the last 2 or 3 years of data, not the entire history of our company. Another thing you can do is, if you've got like a big centralized database that's got all your web products, you've got all your customer information, everything like that, think, well, do I want to also store all my employee records on that database server? Maybe I can have a separate database server for my employee records somewhere else. And so you're sort of splitting it up, meaning that if someone does get in and they're attacking your system, they've got to go after multiple different areas, which might have different stacks in front of them and present different challenges. Another of the key design criteria for any system that is related to safety is the ability to fail safely. In practice, this means that if a system encounters a fault, it should be able to shut itself down into a safe state, one that isn't going to kill people, basically. With a nuclear power plant, remember that a key aspect is to be able to remove that excess heat from the reactor core even after it has been shut down. So a nuclear power plant that fails safely needs to be able to deal with that heat somehow. A talk on nuclear safety could not possibly be complete without a look at the most famous nuclear accident in history, which was that of Chernobyl. Now, the Chernobyl accident occurred on the 26th of April, 1986. That was quite a long time ago, and the area is still very, very radioactive. Probably don't want to go there. What happened was Russian scientists were performing an experiment on one of the reactors to do with how it worked when it was at low power. And in order to do so, they disabled a lot of the safety systems in the reactor so they could actually perform this experiment without them kicking in and saying, no, you can't do that. So that was a bad idea to start with. They were also operating the reactor outside of its design limits. No one had ever done this with this reactor before. So it was already a really unsafe situation. Now, part of the problem that happened at Chernobyl was the reactor design was a little bit different to the one I showed at the start of the talk. It used water as both a moderator, which increased the reaction, and as a control element in the design as well, which to sort of like slow the reaction in a sort of a two-way thing. Now, the problem with the reactor at Chernobyl is when the water boils, when the reactor gets hot, it ceases to be as good at moderating the reaction and slowing it down. That means that if it gets into a situation where the cooling is restricted and the flow isn't constantly supplying cool water to the reactor, and some of the water in the reactor vessel is allowed to boil, it actually causes the reaction to speed up. This means that more water will boil, the reaction will speed up more, and you get a sort of a runaway situation, which is what actually caused the accident at Chernobyl. It got way too hot, things caught fire, and it exploded, and spread nuclear material and radioactive waste across a large area of Eastern Europe. This is an example of not failing safe. Okay? If we have a look at one of the more modern designs of nuclear reactor, it's a pebble bed reactor. Now, what happens here is the nuclear material is actually stored in these like small balls, about 2 inches across, of graphite. And they have like a radioactive uranium core, and the graphite acts as a moderator in that. But what also happens is, as the pebble heats up, it expands. And what that means is it gets further away from other uranium atoms. That means that less of the neutrons from the reaction actually pass on to other pebbles in the system. This means that as the temperature rises, the reaction automatically slows down, making it much safer, and means that even if you turn the cooling system off in this type of reactor, it actually gets to an equilibrium state, which is actually safe. And it can remain like that for a couple of days without actually having an active cooling system before it actually becomes unsafe. Let's have a look at how we can fail secure. So when we're building systems, quite often we sort of think about what the system needs to do when it's working correctly. But we don't often focus quite as much on what happens when something goes wrong. And if we're looking at security, we want to consider how our system reacts when it's behaving correctly, but also what happens if something goes wrong. A good example of this is HTTPS. Okay? If you are running a HTTPS server and you've also got HTTP running, it's possible for an attacker to sort of force your customers, if they get like a man-in-the-middle situation, to force your customers to go to the HTTP side instead of the HTTPS. That then exposes all their communications between you and the server. It's also possible for them to sort of block certain HTTPS connections and cause HTTPS to fall back to less secure encryption algorithms. Quite a lot of the more recent vulnerabilities that have actually been published are some variant of causing it to fall back to a previously known insecure version. Some of the things you can sort of do to defend against this would be to disable entirely those poor algorithms and also disable HTTP. But also, because browsers will attempt quite often to make a HTTP connection first, if you just type into Chrome or Firefox a URL, first thing Firefox is going to try and do is send a HTTP connection. Now, that first HTTP connection is vulnerable to being snooped upon and potentially compromised. So what we've sort of come up with from a security point of view is a mechanism called HTST. And that's like saying to a web browser, whenever you come to this site, always connect using HTTPS. And that means that the browser will automatically connect to it. So HTST is a good way of sort of failing secure in this instance. Because that forces your browser to always connect to your site securely. Okay? There's many other examples of systems which don't fail in a secure manner or leak information, such as stack traces or database queries when things go wrong. As with sort of everything else in this talk, the important thing to take away isn't a list of items to look out for. You don't want to be just ticking off saying, no, we don't have stack traces, no, we don't have database queries and error messages, but a question to ask yourself. What happens to the security of my system when something goes wrong? Can an attacker leverage this error to get access to my system or to gain extra access to the system if they're already inside? Okay? And when you start thinking about those questions and think about the answers, you then think, how can we stop that and how can we secure that? And in turn, you're building in more security into your system. Okay, so to conclude, safety-critical software engineering is based on the principle that you cannot make a system which is 100% safe 100% of the time. However, the techniques I've sort of highlighted today are used to analyze the behavior of such a system, which could lead it to becoming unsafe, and allows the designers of that system to implement effective mitigations for when those things do go wrong and prevent it from becoming unsafe. The same is true of security. It's unlikely anyone's ever going to build some software that doesn't have a bug in it. And some of those bugs are going to be security bugs. So it's impossible to always have a system which is 100% secure. But by using some of these techniques that are used to engineer safety, to engineer security, we can improve the overall security of our system even in the event of some components of it failing. And hopefully we can actually prevent a major outlet of leaking data of your customers to potential attackers. So to quickly recap, we looked at fault tree analysis, which is a method to identify undesirable outcomes in a system and trace back to their cause. If you don't do this up front and you happen to do it after your system has failed, it's actually called root cause analysis. Okay? Ideally, you want to do it up front. The extent to which you do depends on the level of risk of the data you're storing and how sort of critical it is. You could just go back Monday morning and just start on a whiteboard and say, well, what are some bad things that could happen in our system, and what are the sort of the security failures that could lead to them happening? get a couple of colleagues around, discuss it, and see if you can find any holes that you can plug. Obviously, if you're storing credit card information or health information or anything that's really critical, you might want to go a lot further and actually officially document this and keep it up to date on an internal wiki. If you do that and your software gets audited, the auditors will love you for it because they'll be able to go, oh, look, you've already looked at all of those things. Great. Okay. Another thing we looked at is identifying areas of concern and layering defenses. Don't just rely on one thing to protect your network. Even if you've got an application that's only running on your internal network, you should still be using HTTPS. You should still be requiring usernames and passwords to log in, unique to each person, and things like that, as sort of appropriate to the system itself. Look out for single points of failure. Obviously, things like administrator passwords, because we don't want to go to all this effort to secure our systems and then just have them compromised because somebody left their USB key containing their public key to access all the systems on the bus. So try and reduce the impact of such a failure and sort of take greater care with your security efforts around the key components. And finally, handle failures in a secure manner. So when something goes wrong and your application falls over, make sure you handle that failure in a way that does not compromise the security. If you're relying on, say, an authentication service that's a third party, what happens if it goes offline? Will it lock everyone out, which is probably a good thing because that's failed securely, or will it just allow anyone to just have unlimited access to your system? That's probably a bad thing. Okay? Just think of these questions, and that's going to help you design more secure software. Thank you very much.